Now, the next high-risk global disaster scenario, which is going to be intentional or possibly even unintentional in the case of artificial intelligence, is going to be some kind of computer virus or cyber attack. Now, the modernization of the electrical grid in all its glory has allowed us to optimize all of the transactions of society. This networking of society is increasing at an exponential rate. But as things become more networked on this open circuit on the internet, they become more vulnerable to cyber attacks. A prime example of this was Stuxnet, which was a US-led cyber weapon which was developed to help disrupt the Iranian nuclear program. Hackers have the potential to disrupt these various control systems, be they related to the transmission of electricity through the power grid or blowing the transformers themselves. This is called a denial of service attack. It has been done, and it's increasingly more likely to happen in the future as the smart grid becomes more networked. There are 54,000 power substations in the United States that comprise the three main power grids. Only small amounts of these substations would have to be compromised to disable a significant portion of the power grid. The damage from a cyber attack could be very extensive and long-lasting. Any incapacitated substation could take from 9 days to over a year to repair. Now, the United States, to the best of my knowledge, has three major power grids: the West, the East, and the Texas power grids. So if you had several incapacitated substations throughout these three power grids that were not functioning properly for 1 year, imagine the chaos that might ensue when people did not have energy to power the modern world. We all know what that's going to look like. If you don't, go and check out my After the Collapse series, and you'll get a good sense of what it might look like after a few months with no rule of law. This is going to have a very detrimental effect on things like the wastewater facilities, the information tech sector, communications, power distribution, traffic lights are not going to work properly. It's going to lead to total gridlock and pandemonium in the streets. Crime rates are known to increase during power outages. Just imagine what would happen in a prolonged power outage scenario, especially after all the lowlifes within society caught word that the lights weren't going to be coming back on for a long time. There was a case in December 2015 where the Ukraine was a victim of a power grid cyber attack. Nearly 250,000 people were impacted when many of the electrical substations were put offline. Many experts warn that this sort of attack is easily scalable to other metropolitan locations. So the reason why this situation is so likely is because it could be intentional or unintentional. It could be localized or it could be global. Due to the increasingly networked nature of the world, it becomes more and more likely by the day, and because it's happened several times throughout history. And additionally, in a global climate which is rife with conflict, tension, competition, it's only a matter of time before a state-supported attack like this is launched, as this might also be seen by many as a way of averting a full-blown nuclear exchange. Imagine a cyber attack which was geared towards crippling the power grid of any given country prior to the invasion of that country. This would most certainly be a part of the military strategy of any modern, full-blown World War III scenario. Now, the next most likely scenario is going to be the Malthusian or environmental catastrophe. The Malthusian Theory posits that after a certain point of time, if a population grows too much, eventually that population is going to collapse. This is because the production of the resources, namely food, that's needed to sustain that population cannot keep pace with population growth. Therefore, in theory, there should be some massive die-off. Thomas Malthus suggested that it's only with technological innovations do great leaps in population arise. For example, after the agricultural revolution, when we started to use gasoline-powered machines for large-scale farming, the population of the planet has nearly tripled in the last 100 years. Now, there is a documentary by the BBC which talks about overpopulation and how the human population, although it's been growing almost exponentially in the last 100 years, is actually set to slow down due to things like infertility, the fact that as the developing world develops, people tend to want to have less children when they have more disposable income and when they start to take on Western values and traditions. People get into a more selfish mode of existence in which it's all about me, and you have the breakdown of the family unit, where the goal of most individuals is not to have a family, rather to indulge in all aspects of this modernized culture, and thus people have less kids. You could argue this is also due to financial reasons, but back in the day when people were having 10 and 12 kids, everybody was poorer than they are now. So with the advent of contraceptives and the self-serving hedonistic society, it's become quite apparent why populations within the Western world are barely sustaining themselves. It's thought that people who are in India today, as their standard of living gets elevated, they're going to have less and less children, which is going to lead to a population reduction, although we are still at least 100 years away from something like that happening. And that's not to say that it won't become trendy again to have children someday. It's just the current trend seems to be that as countries develop, people have less and less kids. Now, regardless, as the world begins to develop, people begin to consume more and more. As standard of living increases, every human being consumes more and more resources. So the people in the developed world who at one point maybe only consumed 1/100th of what a average Westerner, Canadian, American, or European consumed, they are now consuming 1/8 of what those Westerners consume. So you've just increased the consumption of 1 billion people tenfold. Now what happens then when 6 to 9 billion people all start enjoying the quality of life that we enjoy in the Western world? Well, without any substantial change to the way that we consume energy and commodities, it's likely that the environments we inhabit are not going to be able to sustain these material demands of the human population. The reason why the Malthusian environmental catastrophe is so likely is because it's happened before in the past. It's also a mathematical fact that we live on a finite planet while we have exponential population growth, at least for the time being, and what should be also noted, and more importantly, exponential consumption growth. That's what most people don't talk about. They talk about population growth, but it's really about consumption growth. Because if we all consumed half as much as we do now, we could easily sustainably support twice the amount of people who are on the planet nowadays. So the likelihood of environmental disaster is high, and I'm going to give you a few reasons why. We have the collapse of various ecosystems due to man's infringement upon these increasingly rare natural places. We have the climate extremes with extreme cold days in the winter and extremely hot days in the summer, increased forest fires due to droughts, monocultural agricultural practices where 90% of the arable land in the world has been converted from its biodiverse, pristine form to an area which is limited to planting one crop with obscene amounts of pesticides and increasingly more so genetic modification to help these crops survive the harsh climate extremes that we're seeing nowadays. We also have overfishing. The world's ocean stocks have been depleted. There's been many cases of fish stocks that have been totally collapsed by human overfishing. Just the general pollution, pumping the air with toxins, the Pacific Ocean garbage patch, the amount of things we waste, the amount of food we waste every year is appalling. And the landfills keep getting bigger and bigger. On the other hand, we have deforestation, the clear cutting of vast swaths of land across Canada and the United States. We have desertification. Places which were once lush with organic matter now become arid desert wastelands. There's the issue of air quality as a result of all of our industrial practices. There's the issue also of invasive species, whether it's directly or indirectly. Man has transported various flora and fauna out of its environments of origin into foreign environments, and that has caused huge disruptions in those ecosystems, sometimes collapsing those ecosystems entirely. You have plagues, you have famines, you have topsoil erosion, temperature fluctuations, contaminated waterways, a reduction in the biodiversity, which would create for some resilience in order for us to weather the coming storm of rapid environmental deterioration. You have the decline of natural selection due to highly regulated and domesticated practices. And remember, it's natural selection that has allowed humanity to evolve and allowed any animal to evolve to the state that it's in now. If you replace that by the arbitrary selective breeding that's done on these animals, you quickly come to find this too will lead to decreased resilience in the face of pathogenic outbreaks. You have an economic model which is built on conspicuous consumption, which doesn't seem to be slowing down in one bit, aside the encouragement for people to recycle. And at the end of the day, you have resource depletion. At some point, the resources that we use, that we convert to another form in terms of combusting them or what have you, are going to be depleted. Whatever toxic substance isn't able to escape back to the earth, it will be burned up in smoke and returned to the earth in some way, shape, or form. So these big three, in my personal opinion, are things which are going to be enough to bring down the entire grid. Pandemic, cyber attack, and environmental collapse are going to be the most likely global threats that we face in the future. Now, in a more regional sense, obviously the most high-risk situation of all is going to be a natural disaster, be it a hurricane, a small-scale volcano, a tsunami, tornadoes, extreme cold weather, massive heat waves, floods, ice storms, earthquakes, forest fires, droughts, hailstorms, blizzards. All of these things are likely coming to a theater near you, and that theater is going to be your backyard, so get ready for it. Terrorism, of course, is going to be inevitable as well, be it on a small active shooter scale or something that approaches the scope of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. But terrorism becomes increasingly more likely in the increasingly volatile geopolitical climate that we find ourselves in. I think global conflict or a full-blown World War III scenario is more of a medium risk and less likely to occur, in spite of the fact that it's occurred so many times throughout history before, and indeed it's probably inevitable again, we could say. I just don't think we are quite there yet. I think our leaders understand the gravity of the situation and why we should want to avert nuclear warfare for the benefit of mankind as a whole, because that would spell the end of mankind if we were to have a full-scale mutually assured destruction nuclear exchange. Now, I know a lot of people don't think that a mutually assured destruction scenario is even possible, and they think that the US would just bounce back fairly quickly. I think there's another thing coming, because of course, if everywhere has been nuked, there's going to be nowhere to get power, there's going to be nowhere to manufacture new commodities for people to consume. People will be subsisting and fighting over the scraps of the grid that remain until some sort of order is restored and the grid can get back to building itself. But that's going to be a highly drawn out and unlikely scenario that could take decades for any semblance of a stable democratic government to re-emerge. Now, there's some of the other scenarios which are unlikely because they've never happened before. We have absolutely no impact on whether they happen. They are not predictable. I'm talking about things like an alien invasion or an asteroid. It's probably even more predictable than an alien invasion. But I'm going to save that topic for another video because I want to keep this video down to earth and rooted in what we know. And namely because a video like that would be purely speculative. So stay tuned for that entertaining rant coming up. Don't forget, you can go to CanadianPreparedness.com or click through the links in the description for all your survival and preparedness needs to help support this channel. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.